What is up, you guys, and welcome back. Thank you for being here with me today. Today I'm talking all about things that your ego does that keeps your shadow hidden. Essentially, these are ways that the ego can kind of stay in comfort. It can stay in security and sort of just sleeping. And ultimately, that's going to keep you from your best life. So today I have 12 things that you do, probably unconsciously, that keep the shadow hidden. If you missed it last time, I talked all about the shadow, what it was. You can go back and listen to that episode. The link is in the show notes. But today is all about shining a new light on some of these shadow aspects. And so I talk about denial. I talk about rationalizations, avoidance, distraction, repression, suppression, even using humor. We can use humor sometimes in sort of a bad way. We talk about the search for gurus, altered awareness, or getting high or drunk, splitting off, or dissociation, projections, transference. And then at the very end, because that's kind of heavy, I do give you a way forward. So how to integrate a little bit. Next week, we're talking all about shadow work. That would be the integration piece. The integration piece that we've been kind of missing in this whole thing. We've been talking a lot about what the shadow is and how you can identify certain things or how you can use things in your conscious awareness to point to a shadow aspect, but then what do you do with it afterwards? So that's what next week is going to be about. But today we're talking all about some of these things that the ego does. So I hope that you guys enjoy this episode. Let's just jump right into it. Welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am so happy to have you here with me today. Actually, you know what? It has occurred to me that I always say welcome back, but I never really say welcome to our new listeners. So if you are new here, thank you for joining me. I'm happy to have you. And if you are returning, again, thank you for coming back. I enjoy your support. And I'm also happy to have you here with me today. Today, we are talking all about how the shadow stays hidden. So last week, we talked about the shadow, what it was, some analogies, how you might see it manifesting in your life, how it's showing up. And today, I'm taking that just a little bit further. These things that I'm going to talk about, there's like a laundry list of things. So these things that I'm going to talk about, and I'm just going to cover them briefly, but they're tactics that the ego uses to keep the shadow hidden. And my intention for doing this episode is first to kind of categorize some of these things because it really helps us to understand and make sense of what the ego does and how the shadow can stay hidden. We talked last time all about how the shadow is really elusive in a lot of ways. It's very hard to put our fingers on because how do you know what you don't know? And then furthermore, how do you know what you don't want to know or you're actively trying to not know? And so that's kind of the thing. So when we can categorize these, we can start to make sense of them. If I'm naming some of these tactics, maybe you start to see, oh, that's how that shows up in my life. Maybe that's how it shows up in somebody else's life. And so you really start to get a feel for it because the truth is that when we talk about things like shadow, the unconscious, or anything like that, it's way better to get a feel for it versus to try to put it into complete 100% literal terms. It just sort of loses its essence when we boil it down that way. But here's the thing. If we want to know about it, we have to be willing to talk about it. We have to be willing to go there in terms of trying to explain it, trying to use our words. But just know that every time we try to explain something, it's going to miss the mark. And so what we can do, though, is we can look at this problem from several different angles, with several different lenses, from several perspectives. And with all of those perspectives, we can sort of paint this picture, right? And that helps us address things a little bit more. So all that to say that the more you learn about the shadow, the more you're going to get to know it. The more you're going to get to realize what work it plays in your life, how your shadow has been kind of running your life from the background. and you can kind of, you can really get a feel for it. And there's just no like catch-all, unfortunately. Like I said last time, I have yet to find one source that really, really boils it down and really, really captures the essence of the shadow. But with that said, I want to just give credit where credit is due. The one author that I have found, actually there's two that talk a lot about the shadow. Okay, there's three that talk about the shadow. And these authors are James Hollis, and he is a Jungian analyst. I think he does the best job. There is David Richo, Richo. I'll link all these people in the show notes. But there's David Richo. He talks a little bit about the shadow. He has a book called Shadow Dance, which I thought was really good. And then there's Robert Augustus Masters, and he also does some shadow work stuff. He has some really good insights. But again, I don't think any one of them is really great at, nailing it in a way that I have been able to make sense of it, right? It's been a journey and an accumulation of all of these things. But everything that I talked to you today pretty much is like a compilation of things that James Hollis has written in his books. And by the way, so the shadow is a Jungian concept, meaning Carl Jung coined the term shadow to refer to these things that we don't really want to know about ourselves. So the best place to go if you wanted to know about the shadow is probably Carl Jung directly. His memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he talks a little bit about this. And again, it's not very easy to pin down. It's not something that you can just say, boom, blanket statement, here's the shadow. It's very, very elusive. You have to kind of talk about it in different ways so you get a feel for it. So with that said, I'm just going to kind of dive right in. So the first tactic, or the first way that your ego what your ego does to keep the shadow hidden that I have is denial. I did a whole podcast episode on this, and I'll link that in the show notes, but in case you missed it, I'll just give you a real quick synopsis. Denial is self-protective. So before we go ahead and say, well, curse ourselves for not being able to be stronger, for being able to accept what we have been denying, we have to understand that denying protects us, or we think that denying protects us, because we've told ourselves some kind of story of what you don't know can't hurt you, except that, that's not the truth, and it can. What you don't know can hurt you, and in fact it does. And it kind of goes back to this thing that Carl Jung said: if you don't recognize what's in your shadow, it's going to show up in your external reality, and you will call it fate. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of the idea of it. So if you're denying something, you have everything to gain from coming to terms with that. If I pride myself on this person who's very, very rational in political discussions, and I think to myself, I'm so rational, but the reality is that I get really, really emotional only on certain topics, it doesn't take away the fact that I get really, really emotional and I have to deal with the fallout that happens after me getting emotional. Does that make sense? And so me denying that I'm emotional only protects my ego, and it only protects this inflated sense of self. It doesn't help me grow. As long as you stay in denial, you can't change. What you don't know is available for you to change. And I think the main point with denial is to get really, really quiet and to ask your heart deep questions that cut right to the heart of what you're trying to basically fix in your life. The problem with denial is that unless it's a glaring issue, you're really not going to have any incentive to come to terms with what you've been denying. But that's where, this work is never ending. When you dig up things in your unconscious and you get really curious about what your unconscious beliefs are and how your unconscious is running your life, then one by one, bit by bit, we can sort of come to peace with what we've been denying. And what I would say here is that a very effective strategy is to drop your awareness into your heart center and take a deep breath and ask questions and allow the answer to come to you. And the answer will come. And sometimes it's funny because sometimes when you do this, you will be very convinced that the answer is one thing. And then when you get really quiet and you allow the answer to come to you, it's very, very different. And so for me, that's almost like proof that there's, different parts of us, there's different parts of ourselves that are constantly at work here. And our unconscious plays a big part, right? And so whether you want to call that voice that comes to you, the greater connected whole, or the universe, or your own unconscious, or your soul, or God, or whatever it is, there's a piece of you that is outside of your conscious awareness. And listening to that voice is very, very important. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through a couple of really deep questions that kind of get to the heart of this. And by the way, you can even ask this sort of like a prayer. And if you're not sure who to pray to anybody, like if that doesn't really make sense to you, you can pray to your soul. You can pray to, maybe a lost loved one. You could pray to the universe or whatever makes sense to you. But when you say a prayer or something like that, you can just open yourself up. Please show me where I'm contributing to the problem. Please show me what I've been denying, And I think that intention, prayer is really just an intention. So as you pray, you're just sending out an intention to be open to something new, to be open to something that, your ego has not already known. And so when you pray, like set your, or just set your intention, you don't have to pray. I just think that that's a really effective strategy, but set an intention to be open to this kind of thing. And then ask yourself these questions. Ask yourself things like, what do I really want? Where did this thing originate? Is it true? Is it true is a really powerful question. And if you wanted to see some really amazing insights, I would check out Byron Katie's work, because with that question, we ask ourselves, is it true? We're really just questioning reality, and we're questioning reality, but more so we're questioning our perception of reality, the story that filters our lens of reality. Does that make sense? And so that can really be a powerful question to dismantle our egoic beliefs and where we've been telling our story around a certain thing. So with that, you could ask yourself the question, what is the truth? And let that come to you. Or what is the story that I'm telling myself? You could ask yourself, if I were to allow pure honesty to come through here, what would a new narrative be? And I think that is a really powerful thing to do as well. Say, if I were, like, consider things in hypothetical, because when we say things like, what is the new narrative, we're implying that there has to be a new narrative, right? And that can be so scary to the ego that it's almost like defenses completely go up at that time. And so if we say something like, if I were to allow myself pure honesty, or if I were to consider this, or what could another potential be, you're not marrying yourself to that outcome. Rather, you're just allowing the possibility of it. And that's a little bit safer, right? For the ego to sort of come to terms with and to drop its guard. Okay, the second one is rationalizations. Here's the thing. Rationalizations sometimes hint to denial, and the truth is that we usually act on impulse through emotions. Impulses are way faster than conscious thought. So fast. And, that's a very good survival mechanism. Like, I don't need to rationalize my way through how to run away from a lion. And that allows me to run away from a lion if we make it really primitive. But that primitive thought pattern, or that primitive pattern, is basically always at work, whether we realize it or not. And so the truth is that most of us, we're acting on emotions almost all day. And then what we do is we rationalize after the fact. We rationalize our way out of it later. And we do this because that feels really good to the conscious parts of our egos. We don't like to see ourselves as irrational or impulsive, except that we are. And so when we come up with a rationalization, it helps us not feel that way. And so that's good. But the truth is, the sooner we accept that we are impulsive and sometimes irrational and we act on emotions, then we can actually start to work on it. Goes back to the denial thing. If I'm in denial, I don't know what I can't fix what I don't know that is available for me to fix. And so here's my thought for you around rationalizations. And by the way, we all sort of do this. They're not good or bad, they just exist. So if you're trying to come to terms with a rationalization, could you start, instead of rationalizing your way out of something, could you just start saying something like, I did it because I felt like it, and let that be enough. I did it because I was acting on impulse. That's your way to start being really honest with yourself. And with honesty, you stop using rationalizations to cover things up. Does that make sense? Okay. The third thing that I have is avoidance. Avoidance comes in a lot of different forms. Procrastination is probably the most subtle, yet the most pervasive. Procrastination is sort of a weird one because it's sort of socially sanctioned in a lot of ways. Some people think that there's really no big deal about it, and sometimes even people like pride themselves in being a procrastinator, saying things like, I work better under pressure. I can write a paper best at the 11th hour, and turn it in. It's like it sort of is like a badge of honor. Like, how fast can you do something? And I think this happens like mostly in college, but sometimes then it bleeds over into our actual life. And maybe it doesn't even start in college. Maybe it starts way earlier than that. But either way, it bleeds over to our actual lives. And so procrastination is a way of avoidance, but either way, you're going to have to face what you're avoiding at some point. And so the examples that I can think of here are things like work projects. Either you avoid or procrastinate or starting on that work project. Schoolwork, applying for school, if that's what you're wanting to do. That conversation that you need to have, but you just find ways to kind of wiggle your way out of it every time. Or like, what about looking at a credit card statement? I think I had a conversation with a friend back in the day, and I could totally resonate with it. She was like, I'm just scared to look at my credit card statement. And it's true. It's like, you don't want to look at it because then you have to come face to face with it and acknowledge that maybe you got yourself in a little over your head. But the truth is that kind of stuff does not go away. Bad news does not get better with time. And we have to come to terms with it at one point or another. And so when we avoid things, it helps us, again, sort of just stay in denial about sort of some of these shadow aspects of ourselves. If I avoid looking at my credit card statement, I can say, well, it's not that bad. I can always kind of convince myself that it's not that bad. If I have the credit card statement in front of myself, I know exactly how bad it is. And there's no denying that. I can't wiggle my way out of it. But if I don't really know, or if I don't have that in front of me, then I can always kind of make up a new story around it. But again, that new story is not founded in reality. It's founded in probably a self-protective, ego-comforting kind of situation. And this tactic kind of leads to other unhealthy, destructive behaviors. And this is usually the way it goes. I don't want to look at my credit card statement because it gives me a wash of anxiety to think about not having enough money to pay it off. And so I can sort of tell myself a new story and talk myself out of it. But that underlying anxiety still exists, even if I consciously kind of can get rid of it. And so what usually happens is that that underlying anxiety leads to a lot of discomfort. And usually what we can do is then rely on some kind of distraction or addiction or something to, make us feel a little bit better, kind of take away that anxiety a little bit. And so here's the thing though, if your comfort mechanism is shopping, then you avoiding your credit card statement may lead to you shopping more. Does that make sense? Because it feels better than coming to terms with that anxiety that your credit card statement produces. And so the work here is just to simply, you have to face it. It doesn't get better. The next one that I have is distraction. And like I said, distraction and avoidance go hand in hand. And what we do with distraction is we sort of use things in our external reality, again, to make us feel better. We rely on something else other than ourselves to be that comfort source for us. And so it's pick your poison, right? What is your vice? I really highly recommend kind of asking yourself this question. What is your vice? We all have them. And this is something that could be a full-blown addiction or just an attachment or just an unhealthy behavior pattern. There's a lot of different ways. I've talked a lot about, my vice is caffeine for a lot of different reasons. Also in the past, I have used shopping, and I'm not saying that I'm 100%, free and clear of these things, but I've used shopping. I also think that vices could be things like acting childish or reverting to childish behavior. That could be like a comforting thing for you. It could be TV, it could be food, it could be sex, it could be gambling, it could be something harder a little bit like alcohol or even prescription medications. All of those things can provide a distraction. And when you know your vice, when you know that thing that you constantly turn to, and you start to see it as, okay, that could be a problem, or it's starting to become a problem, you will gain so much insight into yourself if you know that that's your tendency. Because to me, now I know when I'm starting to shop, when I start to feel that feeling of needing to shop, it's a really good indication for me to pay attention to myself and ask myself, where am I feeling inadequate? Where am I feeling like my life is lackluster? Where am I feeling that my life is boredom? And so it's really just an indication for me to ask that to myself. When I feel like I want to, drink 3-4 cups of coffee in a day instead of moderating, what is that? What is it about it? Why do I feel like I want that rush? When you know your vice, it starts to become an early alarm signal, and then you can turn inwards instead of really giving into it. And I'm not saying this works 100% of the time. It definitely doesn't. But if it could work 10% of the time, if it could work 20% of the time, if it could start to move you in the direction, wouldn't it be worth it? Okay, the next one is repression. So this is sort of like forgetting or burying things that you don't want to know, or you don't want to face, or you don't want to be aware of. This is my example. If you've ever been burned in a relationship and told yourself, never again will I ever be that vulnerable. And the next relationship you start to get into and you're like, all of a sudden now I can't connect with people. And you feel like that you want to find that deep connection with your person, but you've totally close yourself off to love. It could be a long time ago, or it could be recent. Either way, you're looking for that connection. You told yourself you wouldn't be that vulnerable because that could lead to hurt or heartbreak. What you are repressing in that case is the human need for deep connection. We all need deep connection. We cannot go this life alone. That's not the way it works. As much as we want to think so, the work is really to stop relying on your family of origin or the people that, were defaulted in your life, and start to create those new connections and find those people that support you and what you want to do. That's how you find meaningful connections. You just probably had found it in a person that was based on something that maybe that wasn't even you, or maybe that was you at the time, but then you needed to come back and you've evolved and you've grown. And so the work is to find your people, not necessarily to avoid connection or repress your need for connection. Other things that we can repress are our deepest desires, usually sacrificed at the cost of financial stability or security, like with a job, right? We repress our soul's messages to us. We repress who we really are without all of the masks, right? These are very common things for us to repress. And we do this because we want so desperately, again, this goes back to like the human connection, that need for human connection. We want that so badly. And if you haven't, branched out and found your people, the people that will accept you no matter what, if you're in that transitory period, that can be really a scary thing. And if you haven't found your people, can be very difficult to take those steps. And so again, like, this isn't a judgment. We don't need to judge ourselves, and really judgment of ourselves in this case is going to make it 100 times worse. We just have to recognize, hey, these are things that we do, and there's probably shadow aspects hidden underneath them. And so when I'm finding myself repressing something, when I find myself talking to myself like that, again, you could come back to these questions to ask yourself, is it true? Do I not need human connection? Do I not need to follow my soul? Is money the most important thing for me at this time? And if the answer is yes, then the answer is yes, but at least you can start with having a conversation about yourself, right? Okay, the next one, closely related, is suppression. So suppression is like constantly pushing away things that you don't want to face, or redirecting your awareness on something to somewhere in the present. It's not necessarily in the same way that I was talking about distraction, but it's more like sort of like bypassing. And if you don't know what bypassing is like, there's a spiritual feel-good philosophy out there that's something like positive vibes only, and if you feel negative vibes, you're going to attract negativity. If you feel positive vibes, you're going to attract positivity. And so what we do is if we're starting to feel negative, what we'll do is we'll be like, no, it's fine, just look on the bright side. We're constantly distracting ourselves with a happier thought. We tell ourselves, it's fine, it's going to be fine, and we don't ever allow ourselves to feel depths of emotion. We never allow ourselves to get really honest or vulnerable about what we really need. And so we just keep kind of blowing ourselves off, to be honest. We're kind of like lying to ourselves about what we really need or what we really want. And so suppression is like a very, it's a very effective way to do that. And so if you find yourself, this is another time to get quiet, and pretty much everything, all of these, if we find a time to get quiet, and really ask ourselves, okay, am I missing something? Am I blowing past something? Because the truth is, it doesn't go away. It just gets buried. And if it gets buried, then it ends up in that, proverbial closet, and you're going to attract things in your external reality because those things in your closet want to be realized. They want to be dealt with. This is your history you're talking about. So the next one is humor. And again, I want to reiterate that these are not bad. They just are, right? Especially like humor. This is something that kind of gets me. Humor can be used as a tactic to keep your shadow hidden. Humor can be a way to sort of, like I said, bypass or suppress. You could use humor to suppress your way out of something. These are not cut and dry, all individualistic. They totally bleed over into each other. And you could have multiple aspects here at work. Again, we're just kind of shining the light on different areas, and we want to talk about it so you get a bigger picture. But humor is a really good, amazing trait that can be used either constructively or destructively. It just depends on how you're using it. And I would say if you use humor too unconsciously, it might be a bit destructive. So here are some examples of this. Probably the most obvious example I can think of is self-deprecating humor. That's like when you're talking basically crap about yourself, when you're saying like, I'm the fat guy and I'm owning it, and I know everybody's laughing at me, and so I'm just going to say it before anybody else can say it. If that's you and you're self-deprecating, if you're using humor, what is underneath that? What do you not want to face about it? I think it was David Richo that said that humor is a mechanism of covering up what you're absolutely afraid of. And I think this was in his book, Shadow Dance, but he also said, like, if you want to know what you're afraid of and you're not really sure, look at what you find hilarious. And I thought that was a really interesting and thought-provoking statement. And it's funny because I started thinking about what kind of humor do I really gravitate towards. You know what I love? I love somebody making an absolute fool of themselves. I love The Office, Michael Scott, that personality that just doesn't get it. And it's like, well, is it possible that I could be afraid of being that guy, of being the person that just doesn't get it? So that's my realization, but what is it for you? What could it be for you? And it's just a thought exercise. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's definitely a deep-seated fear underneath it, but something to consider, something to ponder. Let the answer come to you. Another example of humor is if you turn that humor outwards, and this is kind of like the dark side of humor. And so we could be kind of running into projections when I use this example, but using the humor in an outward directed fashion where you joke about somebody's weight or somebody's intelligence or something about somebody and you say, oh, that was just a joke, right? We all have either been at the receiving end of this or used this in some way. And we've used humor to say, I didn't mean that. That was just a joke, to kind of diffuse the situation or to basically, not have to face what we really meant, not have to own up to that, not have to face the confrontation that comes with that or what we really think, And so I think a lot of times humor can be used in that way to kind of cover up our malicious intent. That's a shadow aspect because nobody wants to admit that we had maliciously intended that comment. The next one is the search for gurus or somebody who has figured it out. And again, I want to reiterate that this is not necessarily a bad thing, but only maybe when it's used unconsciously. When it's used unconsciously, it could be more destructive than it can be constructive. Does that make sense? And so the search for a guru, it's kind of hard because, in some way, when you listen to a podcast or you listen to a book or you watch a YouTube channel and you're trying to get life advice, isn't that kind of like a search for a guru? Isn't that somebody who's figured it out so that you didn't have to? The problem is, I think, when we search and search and search and search and you never do the work yourself. This would be like if you had the tendency to read up and talk, I don't know if you guys know anybody like this, but there are certain people who can tell you facts about everything, what you should do with your money, how you should invest, what diet you should be on, what career path you should be on. They know everything, but they haven't implemented it in their own life. That then is a shadow aspect. That person, maybe you see this in yourself, but that tendency to know what to do, but then fail to implement, it's probably covering something up. Okay, the next one is altered awareness. So getting high, getting drunk, basically Vegas, Sin City, is a way for us to sort of merge with our shadow, like a safe place to allow the shadow to emerge, but then having the ability to walk away from it and go back to normal life. That's not shadow integration if we're doing that. And it's probably fun, to be honest. And I'm not saying that I'm not a believer in never getting drunk or never getting high. I think that there's a place and a time for that. But if that's your escape, if you're using that kind of stuff as a chronic means for escape, then of course, there could be a shadow aspect underneath that. The next one is splitting off or disassociating, compartmentalizing areas of your life. This is my work, and this is my home life, and this is my parent life, and they don't mix. When I'm this person, I'm this person. When I'm over here, I'm over here. I think that the most obvious example is maybe a businessman who lives a double life. He travels for work, has a mistress on the side, and then comes home to his family and is a total family man in normal life. And I would say that that's probably an extreme example. Not a lot of people can pull that off, but I think maybe we all kind of can have this tendency to some degree to do that on a regular basis. And the question is, where do you do that? I think it would be like, where do you hide yourself to certain people? Do you go to work and are you like, I don't want to talk about what I do on my side business at work? That's an example of splitting off. And then the question is why? And why are you afraid to show that part of yourself to your coworkers? Or why are you afraid to talk about that certain topic that you're really passionate about to your mother or your friends? And it's not to say that you have to be able to do that at some point. It's really a degree of what you're comfortable with as long as you've been honest with yourself the entire time, like, about the whole thing, because the truth is that not everybody's going to get you, and not everybody's going to understand all aspects of your life. And so to a degree, we sort of have to do that. You don't want to go to grandma's house and let me curse up a storm. Does that make sense? Like, you have to know your audience in a way. But the question is, are you hiding parts of yourself unconsciously? Are you hiding parts of yourself because you're not comfortable with it? And if that's the case, if you're not comfortable with it, you got to be honest about that kind of stuff. Another version of splitting off could be sort of like a black, white, right, wrong kind of example, where you see the world in these binary terms, like completely, there's this way and there's this way and there is no middle ground in every situation in life. And I hesitate to say every, because that's a little absolutist, but in everything that I've seen, every time I've asked myself this question, there's always a middle way. And if you've only said to yourself, it has to be this way or this way, and there's no middle way, then that's a version of splitting off. And so that leads me actually directly into my next point, which is projections. And this is when the psyche has been triggered, that we see things out there that we refuse to face in ourselves. If I see myself as good, and I'm absolutely good, and I'm moral and upstanding, and I don't have any vices, and I don't sin, and I kind of deny those pieces of myself, what I will tend to do is I will see things outside of me, and I will see other people that have their vices, and I will see other people's wrongdoings, and I will see other people that lie and cheat and do all these things that are not morally upstanding, so that I don't have to face it within myself. This is a way of distancing ourselves from what we don't want to face. A projection is covering up some kind of shadow aspect. And I think I've said this. I'm planning on doing an episode all about projections. I don't know when that's coming, but stay tuned. But yeah, projections are really about putting that on somebody else so that I don't have to face it within myself. Okay, the last one that I have is transference. So transference is a little different than projections. So transference is when you subconsciously put new people into the same roles that they have played in the past. So this is kind of like the best examples, but also probably the most uncomfortable. And we just have to let's just get used to being uncomfortable. In this work, it's not comfortable. So the only way that we make it better is getting that out of the way and acknowledging that it's not going to be comfortable and moving on with it. So the example that I can come up with is like, say I have an overbearing parent, and in my next relationship or in my adult long-term relationships, I find myself with partners that are consistently overbearing. Or say I had taken care of a parent in the past. I was sort of like a child parent, right? Where I was responsible for the emotional needs of my parents. I was responsible for, taking care. I shoulder that responsibility. I sort of was manipulated into it. And I tell myself I'm not going to be with a person like that, but then I find myself in relationships where I'm constantly trying to save the person that I'm with, and I'm constantly trying to be that parent figure for them. I actually see that quite a bit. And I have an episode coming out, and I don't know when, but it's all about these parental patterns that contribute to our shadow. There are certain types of patterns that I've observed that people go through growing up, and then they lead to subsequent situations and relationships in your life that you just attract that kind of thing. And you're like, I don't know where that came from, but it really came from your upbringing, right? So that is coming. But transference is when we take our past unknowingly and put it on somebody else and said, okay, now you're going to play this role for me. And we do this because, like we talked about last time, the shadow really craves that completion of your cycle, that completion of, we get sort of stuck in traumatic things where we feel out of control. If I have a parent that's an addict and I've been trying to save them, Or I can observe it from my perspective and I'm like, my bleeding heart goes out to them. You come to terms with the fact that, okay, well, I can't save my parent, but you know what? Maybe I could try again with this partner of mine. And so you subconsciously attract somebody who has addictive like tendencies, and it may not be the same, right? Maybe your parent's an alcoholic and your new partner loves video games and has an addiction to video games. And you constantly now all of a sudden you're starting to try to save this partner. You're trying to save this partner, not realizing that really what you're trying to do is save your parent. You're trying to redo that symbolically. And your psyche tells yourself, well, if I can just solve this and if I can just, save this situation, then I can finally free myself from that and my work here is done. But the work is really about yourself. The work is never to change somebody else or save somebody else. The work is to save yourself. We are always asking ourselves, what do I know? What has the past taught me about this moment? We're always asking ourselves, where have I been here before? And so sometimes what we can do is we can take other people and fit them into essentially our family of origin dynamics. Okay, the last point, how does the shadow make itself known? And I probably, maybe there are way more points than this. This is just a parting thought that I have because these are all things that your shadow does to stay hidden. And so it can be kind of easy to be like, okay, well, I do this, I split off, I distract myself a lot, I rationalize a lot, but what do I do? Where do I go from that? How can I turn that into a healthy thing or something that's going to benefit my life? And so let me leave you with this. The shadow makes itself known by assimilation and integration. This is what I mean. When you realize that you have to be open to learning some shadow aspect of yourself, to learning something that you really don't want to know about yourself, in order to assimilate and to integrate, in order to make that part of yourself like a part of yourself, right? Because what you've been doing with your shadow is you've been telling yourself it's not a part of you this entire time. You shoved it in the closet and you painted over the door and you've been denying it in some version. And so in order to assimilate and to integrate, you must come to yourself with an open heart and with compassion for yourself. There is a person that I follow on Instagram named Molly Burney, and my favorite thing that she says is how to stop being a dick to yourself. If you're talking to yourself in some kind of negative pattern, if you're talking to yourself in some kind of self-deprecating way, I suck, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I did that, I'm irredeemable for that, sometimes it can feel almost comforting because then like if we acknowledge it, then somebody else won't catch us off guard and acknowledge it for us. However, it's not healthy. This is a concept that has helped me tremendously. If you knew everybody's story, and if you actually even, forget about everybody else. If you knew your own story, if you can dig into your history, if you can see yourself for the innocent child that you were and somebody who didn't deserve things, but it had happened to them, no one would look crazy. Nobody does things irrationally. We all do things that make perfect sense when you consider our history, our upbringing, our experiences, what we know about the world, our education, our socioeconomic upbringing. Everybody does stuff that makes sense to them, given all of those situations. And the problem is that it only looks crazy when you don't factor those things in. And so if I could leave you with one thing when you're talking about assimilation or integration, like how do I integrate these shadow aspects? Ask yourself, what was your story? And I'm not talking about the story that you're making up right now. I'm talking about your story of your past, your story of your childhood, the story of how you got here. And that's a really powerful thing to do if you have something that's been plaguing you and you have not sat down with yourself. I mean, give yourself an hour. and this is kind of, this is something that I've realized as 2022 is kind of unfolding. It's like, I can give my attention to my kids, to my job, to my work, to my husband, to my extended family members, to my friends, to the food that I eat all day long. I give my attention to all these things, but do I give myself attention? And what would be 15 minutes? What would be 15 minutes a day? Or even if you have this thing that has been on your heart for so long, this unresolved thing that you just feel like you need to address, what would be an hour to sit down and write out your story as completely as you can remember it, and then reread it and see yourself as a kid, as somebody who was just kind of trying to do their best? And I think with that, as you go through that process, man, that brings incredible healing. And what benefit, how positive could that be to your life? I would say above all of the feelings that I could get in life, one of the best has to be when I connect the dots of my past and realize that a reoccurring pattern that I do, or reoccurring actions that I do that I really don't like about myself, or I'm not really proud of it, came from something that had gone unresolved in my past. That is the most, it's indescribable. It's an indescribable feeling to be able to connect the dots and be like, wow, that's where that came from, and then go back in your active imagination and kind of talk yourself down and love yourself and give yourself some really necessary compassion that probably nobody gave you back at that time. But now you're an adult. Now you can do that. So okay, that is what I have for you guys today. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I know it was kind of all over the board, but, maybe this is one that we could come back to over and over and over again and listen to it and see how these patterns kind of show up in our lives, and then start asking the questions. Shadow work is all about asking yourself and letting the answer come. And next time, I'm going to talk about shadow work, like how to do shadow work. A lot of people talk about shadow work, but in order to do shadow work, we have to understand the shadow first. And so that was kind of my objective first. Shadow work is like the tools that you need to have in order to integrate parts of your shadow. And so I'm really excited for that episode. I am planning on having that come out in, 2 weeks from now. So stay tuned for that. Again, thank you if you are new. Thanks for sticking with me, you guys. And thanks for returning if you have been here before. I love sharing this time with you guys. All right, you guys, until next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time.